Hello everyone, this is Derek with Reef Automation, and here's another tutorial for the Neptune Systems Apex. So recently I decided to switch over from two-part to the calcium reactor, and a lot of people have asked, well, what can you do to essentially do the same thing with trident controlled dosing? So what I ended up doing is Hello everyone, this is Derek with Reef Automation, and here's another tutorial on the Neptune Systems Apex. In this tutorial, we're going to go over how you can actually control your calcium reactor with a dose. A lot of people try to use a peristaltic continuous duty pump, such as a Kimura or a Versa from Ecotech, which are great options, but if you have a dose, why not use it for your calcium reactor? So I was given this information. I tweaked it a little bit from Terrence at Neptune Systems, and I altered it just a tad. Now, just keep in mind that the dose is not meant for continuous duty, so you don't want to run it as continuous duty. However, you can associate the dose to turn on and off, similar to that of like a automated calcium reactor that a couple other companies make. So let's get started. Okay, so there's a couple things that you're going to need to do prior to getting this ready. Obviously, you need a solenoid for the CO2 that's going into the unit. It's highly recommended, of course, that you have a pH probe as well going into your calcium reactor. So once you have those two items, you're going to have the following ready to go. So if you look down here, I have my CO2 and I have my Reef calcium reactor, if you can see it down here. The CO2 is my solenoid and the Reef calcium reactor is the dose. The Reef calcium reactor P is just the pump that's inside the calcium reactor, the recirculating pump. So of course, just keep that on all day or however you want to program it. So we're really going to only focus on the Reef CaRx, which is the dose head itself, and the Reef calcium reactor CO2. All right, so to get started, let's take a look at my Reef calcium reactor dose head right here. So when you get into your dose, you're going to want to ignore everything you see here and click on the button here that lets you do your own programming instead of using the table. So for my calcium reactor dose, if you notice that's my dose pump 1, you're going to see that I always have it off, set off, and fall back off. And if output Reef calcium reactor T, which is actually the timer, then I want you to dose a certain amount. I also put in here if there's a leak to turn it off. I also have a contingency if my trident was to go too high, then turn off the calcium reactor dose head. And of course, if my pH goes too low, I want you to turn it off. So this is a good start. So output Reef calcium reactor T is the timer. That is a virtual outlet, whereas the Reef calcium reactor A amount is a profile. So let's take a look at those. So if we go back to my dashboard, and we go to T, this is saying I would like the dose to dose at this particular interval. So what I've done is I've created an OSC. So every 2 minutes, basically, it turns on the dose, and dose is a specific amount. So every 2 minutes, turn on the dose, and then turn off. So it's oscillating to turn it on and off. It's not continuous, and that's how I have it going. So this is something that you can play with. This has been good for me at 2 minutes, but you can adjust that however your tank needs it. You could have it turn off for 10 minutes and turn on for a minute. You could have it, I mean, whatever you'd like to try. Again, this is going to essentially put the high effluent alkalinity and low pH into the tank. So you're going to want to do this sparingly depending on, your tank, your load, and not having that much low pH going in. Okay, so as I said, it's going to turn on every 2 minutes, but what is it going to do every 2 minutes? Well, if we go to the outlet and we go to profiles, I've created a profile called Reef calcium reactor amount. Now, this is very important. This is the rate at which it's going to dose. Now, the higher the rate, the louder the dose is going to be because it's going to be dosing at such a strong amount at 125 milliliters a minute at 100 milliliters per dose means that it's going to take approximately a minute for it to dose 100 milliliters. So keep that in mind. If your oscillator is 2 minutes, you want to keep your dose amount and your dose rate under 2 minutes. Otherwise, of course, it's not going to work. So for me right now, I have it set for 125 milliliters a minute, which is relatively loud. And again, you could bring it down to 7 milliliters a minute if you don't want it to be very loud. And then it's going to dose the same amount. It's just going to take longer because it's only doing 7 milliliters a minute. So you have to increase your OSC, and therefore you're going to be putting a lot more water in a longer time frame, essentially. So I didn't really mess with the dose intervals or the dose count. I just kept it as a high amount because it's only going to dose whatever you put right here at that amount. So again, what it's doing is every 2 minutes, it's dosing a specific amount. So it's consistent. It's always the same amount. Okay? So that's the dose aspect of dosing. Now, after you've done all that, you're going to want to associate the solenoid, which is much easier then. So when we go over here, again, this Reef calcium reactor timer is a virtual outlet, so you would need to create a virtual outlet. If you don't know how to do that, you can take a look at my older videos. So again, we go back to it, and you can notice right now it's on Reef calcium reactor Rex A, which means the dose is currently running at that amount and that so remember, the Reef calcium reactor T is a virtual outlet, and the calcium reactor itself is currently dosing it at the amount that you set. Okay, so now we go to the CO2. CO2 is going to be a lot easier. So obviously, if my pump is off, I do not want the CO2 to be on because it's not going to recirculate it. So what I've set is I have a daytime and a nighttime mode. And what this is doing is it changes the saturation or the concentration during certain periods of the day. So I have a night, and again, you can have as many of these as you want. And these are also virtual outlets. So we have a D and an N, D being day, N being night. When these are on, I want you to then turn on my CO2. So if we go back to the dashboard and we go to the day and night, you will see that I've created two virtual outlets for the day and night. So during the day, I want my CO2 to be between 6.6 and 6.5. You'll notice it's only going to work because I have an if time is approximately 10 o'clock to 10 o'clock. I want you to turn this virtual outlet off. Doesn't matter what's going on over here. I've also made, just as a safety, if the night is on, then I want you to turn it off. I have it as a defer 2 minutes because that way the solenoid has time to relax before it comes back on. And if you go to the other virtual outlet, which is the daytime, it's basically the complete opposite. So I'm taking the time into consideration and I'm taking the pH into consideration. So if I go to daytime now, if I go to nighttime now, so if I go to nighttime, you're going to see that the time is completely opposite. It's going from 10 to 10 opposite, and my CO2 has a different concentration. See that? So essentially what this is doing overall is the dose is dosing at a specific interval every couple minutes and off at other minutes, and I have it at a certain rate. And then I have my CO2 being adjusted during day or night. And that's how you do it. So hopefully that you enjoyed this video. Hopefully learned a little bit about using the dose for your calcium reactor. And if you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comments below. Also, I wanted to mention that the dose is going to work really hard in doing this, so there's a good chance that you might have to maintenance it or repair it or replace it a little sooner than you normally would, because you're going to be, you know, driving it quite a bit every 2 minutes. So just be aware that there's a potential that it might run its course a little bit sooner than normal. Also, again, thank you for watching, and if you have any questions or comments, just leave them in the comment section below. Okay, so that's about it. Um, it's pretty simple. This will automate essentially your calcium reactor and your dose. Keep in mind that the dose is going to be working a lot harder since it's coming on a lot more often than normal. And if you have that milliliter per minute up to, like I do, 125 or even higher, it's going to be loud and the pump's going to actually run a lot more. So it's possible that it could not last as long as it normally would. So just be aware. I've only had it running for about a month and it's been running great and my tank's been very stable. It's going to take some time to stabilize it and tune it in. It's much more time consuming than a standard calcium reactor setup, but if you have a Trident, it's going to make your life a lot easier to get this thing tuned in. So if you have any questions or comments, just leave them below, and I hope you enjoyed the video, and thank you for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.